Some discoveries are too big to keep quiet. In the heart of rural Montana, one farmer's routine morning leads to a find that defies belief. What crashed into his land decades ago? Stay close. The truth will leave you speechless. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. The early October fog rolled thick across the fields of Hartwell Valley, Montana, wrapping the landscape in a blanket of gray silence. The small farming community had always been a place where everyone knew everyone, where handshakes meant more than contracts, and where the land stretched endlessly beneath vast skies that turned purple at dusk. For generations, families had worked this soil, pulling wheat and barley from the earth, raising livestock, and living by the rhythm of seasons that never changed. Among these families was Thomas Mitchell, a man of 63, whose weathered face told stories of long summers and brutal winters. His farm sat on the northern edge of the valley, nearly 400 acres of rolling hills dotted with pine trees and bisected by a narrow creek that ran cold and clear most of the year. Thomas had inherited this land from his father, who had bought it in the late 1950s for next to nothing. Back then, people said the land was cursed, that strange things happened here during the war, but his father had laughed off the rumors and built a life anyway. That morning began like thousands before it. Thomas woke before sunrise, brewed strong coffee in the same pot he'd used for 20 years, and pulled on his work boots that were cracked and faded, but still held together. The air outside was cold enough to see his breath, and the fog was so dense he could barely make out the barn, 50 yards from the house. He grabbed a flashlight, checked on the horses, and filled their troughs with fresh water. The animals stirred softly, their warm bodies steaming in the chill. Everything felt normal, predictable, safe. But as he walked toward the far pasture to check the fence line, something felt different. The ground beneath his boots seemed softer than usual, almost spongy, and there was a faint metallic smell in the air that he couldn't place. He slowed his pace, sweeping the flashlight beam across the grass. The fog swirled and shifted, revealing shadows that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Then he saw it. A depression in the earth, wide and shallow, stretching at least 30 feet across. The grass had been disturbed recently, torn up in jagged strips, and the soil beneath looked dark and churned. Thomas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He had walked this field 100 times and had never seen anything like this. He moved closer, shining his light into the depression. That's when he noticed the glint of metal, dull and corroded, jutting up from the dirt like a broken bone. He knelt down and brushed away the loose soil with his gloved hand. The surface was rough and pitted, covered in decades of rust, but unmistakably metallic. It felt cold even through his gloves, and when he tapped it with his knuckles, the sound was hollow and deep. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a rock or a piece of farm equipment. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong here. Thomas stood up and took a step back, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and in the growing light he could see the outline of the object more clearly. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was part of something larger, something buried beneath the surface. The shape was wrong for anything natural, too angular, too deliberate. He walked around the perimeter of the depression, his mind racing. Could it be an old water tank? A septic system from a homestead that predated his family's ownership? But the size and shape didn't match anything he knew. He crouched down again and dug with his hands, pulling away clumps of wet earth. The metal extended farther than he expected, curving slightly, forming what looked like a ribbed surface. His fingers traced the ridges, and a shiver ran down his spine. This was aluminum or some kind of lightweight alloy, not the heavy steel you'd find in old farm machinery. He stood up quickly, his heart pounding now. The realization hit him slowly, like a wave building offshore before crashing onto the beach. This wasn't just metal. This was aviation material. He looked around the field, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land here was flat and open, perfect for emergency landings or crashes. And suddenly, the old rumors his father had dismissed didn't seem so crazy anymore. People used to talk about planes going down during World War II, training flights that never made it back to base, cargo runs that disappeared in bad weather. The military had been all over Montana during the war, using the vast empty spaces for exercises and supply routes. Could one of those planes have ended up here, buried under his pasture for 80 years? Thomas wiped his forehead, smearing dirt across his face. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what he might have found. He thought about calling someone right away. But who? The sheriff would think he was crazy. His neighbors would laugh. But the metal was real, solid, undeniable. He made a decision. He would dig a little more, just enough to confirm what he suspected. Then he'd make the call. He walked back to the barn, his mind spinning with possibilities, and returned with a shovel and a pickaxe. The sun was starting to rise, burning off the last of the fog, and the valley emerged in shades of gold and green. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. But Thomas heard none of it. His focus was entirely on the ground beneath him. He began to dig. The soil came away easily at first, damp and loose from recent rains. But as he went deeper, he hit resistance, more metal. He cleared away the dirt carefully, revealing a section that was at least 10 feet long and curved like the fuselage of an aircraft. His breath came faster. This was real. This was a plane. A buried plane, right here on his land. He kept digging, uncovering more and more of the structure, until finally he found what looked like a window frame, cracked and covered in grime, but unmistakably part of a cockpit. Thomas dropped the shovel and staggered backward, staring at what he had uncovered. For a long moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of history pressed down on him like a physical force. Somewhere beneath his feet lay a piece of the past. A machine that had once flown through the skies, carrying men and cargo before crashing here and disappearing into the earth. And now, after all these years, it had been found by him. He looked toward the house, where smoke rose from the chimney, and the world continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. He knew that once he made the call, once people started arriving with their questions and equipment and authority, his quiet life would be disrupted in ways he couldn't predict. But he also knew he had no choice. This wasn't just his discovery. It belonged to history. It belonged to the families of whoever had been on that plane. It belonged to the truth. Thomas took a deep breath, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "This is Thomas Mitchell out on Route 47, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I think I found a crashed plane on my property, a really old one. You need to come see this." The response came faster than Thomas expected. Within an hour, a sheriff's patrol car was making its way up the long gravel road to his farm, kicking up dust that hung in the morning air like a veil. Thomas stood by the fence, his arms crossed, watching the vehicle approach. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he didn't notice. His mind was still processing what lay beneath his field, the impossible weight of it, the questions that multiplied with every passing minute. The patrol car stopped near the house, and Deputy Rachel Carson stepped out, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Thomas had known her since she was a kid, remembered when her family had moved to Hartwell Valley from Billings. She walked toward him with purpose, her hand resting casually on her belt. "Morning, Thomas," she called. "Dispatch said you found something unusual out here." Thomas nodded and gestured toward the far pasture. "That's putting it mildly," he said. "Come take a look." They walked together across the field, their boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows that stretched behind them like dark fingers. When they reached the depression, Rachel stopped abruptly, her eyes widening. "Jesus," she whispered. She crouched down and examined the exposed metal, running her hand along the corroded surface just as Thomas had done. "How deep does it go?" Thomas shrugged. "I don't know. I stopped digging once I realized what it was. Didn't want to disturb anything important." Rachel stood up and pulled out her radio. "This is Carson. I'm going to need support out at the Mitchell farm on Route 47. We've got what appears to be a downed aircraft, possibly military, possibly decades old. I need you to contact the FAA and the Air Force Historical Division. This is real." Her voice was calm, but Thomas could hear the tension beneath it. Over the next few hours, the farm transformed into something unrecognizable. More patrol cars arrived, followed by unmarked SUVs carrying men and women in dark jackets with federal badges clipped to their belts. A team from the Montana Historical Society showed up with cameras and measuring equipment. By midday, a military helicopter landed in the adjacent field, and 2 officers in uniform stepped out, their faces serious and professional. Thomas watched it all from his porch, feeling like a stranger on his own land. One of the federal agents, a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself as Agent Lawrence Briggs, approached Thomas with a clipboard. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "we're going to need your cooperation while we assess the site. This could be a significant find, and we need to handle it carefully." Thomas nodded. "What do you think it is?" Briggs glanced back toward the field, where teams were already setting up equipment. "Too early to say for certain, but based on the preliminary assessment, it looks like a C-47 cargo plane. They were workhorses during World War II, used for everything from troop transport to supply drops. If this is what we think it is, it's been here since the mid-1940s. Thomas felt a chill run through him despite the warming day. "Were there people on it?" Briggs met his eyes. "That's what we're here to find out." The excavation began in earnest. A backhoe was brought in, operated by a specialist who moved the machine with surgical precision, peeling back layers of soil while archaeologists and historians watched every movement. Thomas stood at the edge of the site, unable to look away. The plane emerged slowly, like a whale rising from the deep. First, the tail section appeared, the vertical stabilizer bent at an unnatural angle. Then the wings, one of them sheared off completely, the other folded beneath the fuselage. The body of the plane was remarkably intact, considering it had been underground for so long, though the aluminum skin was eaten through with corrosion in places, and the cockpit windows were shattered and filled with dirt. By late afternoon, they had exposed most of the aircraft. It lay at a steep angle, nose down, as if it had plunged into the earth and been swallowed whole. The serial numbers on the tail were still partially visible, faded but readable. One of the historians photographed them immediately and began cross-referencing them with military records on a laptop. Thomas overheard fragments of their conversations, mentions of flight manifests, missing aircraft reports, and families who had never known what happened to their loved ones. The weight of those words settled over him like a heavy coat. This wasn't just metal and machinery. This was someone's father, brother, son. Agent Briggs approached him again as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. "Mr. Mitchell, we've confirmed the identity of the aircraft. It's a C-47 that went missing on March 12, 1945, during a routine supply run from Great Falls to Seattle. There were 4 crew members on board. None of them were ever found." Thomas swallowed hard. "They're still in there, aren't they?" Briggs nodded slowly. "We believe so. We'll know more tomorrow when we can safely enter the fuselage. This is now a recovery mission." That night, Thomas sat alone in his kitchen, the house dark except for the single light above the table. Outside, floodlights illuminated the crash site, and he could see the silhouettes of people moving back and forth, working through the night. He thought about those men, the crew who had climbed into that plane 80 years ago, who had flown into bad weather or mechanical failure or just terrible luck, and who had never made it home. He thought about their families, waiting for news that never came, living with the ache of not knowing, and now, by pure chance, he had given them an answer. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the twisted metal, the broken windows, the dark interior of the plane that still held its secrets. When dawn broke, pale and cold, he was already standing by the window, watching the team prepare for the next phase of the excavation. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Stories like Thomas's remind us that history is never really gone, it's just waiting to be found. What would you do if you discovered something like this on your property? Would you be afraid, excited, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's find out what was inside that plane. The morning of the third day arrived with a biting wind that swept across the valley, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Thomas stood near the excavation site, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, watching as a specialized team prepared to enter the aircraft. They wore protective suits and breathing equipment, moving with the careful precision of people who understood they were about to disturb a grave. The fuselage had been fully exposed now, and a section of the hull near the cargo door had been carefully cut away to provide access. Agent Briggs stood beside Thomas, his expression somber. "We're going in now," he said quietly. "This part is always difficult. We don't know what condition things will be in after all this time." Thomas nodded, unable to find words. Around them, a crowd had gathered: law enforcement, historians, a chaplain from the nearby Air Force base, and several journalists who had been permitted to document the recovery from a distance. The air felt heavy with anticipation and respect, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something sacred. The first specialist climbed through the opening, his headlamp cutting through the darkness inside. For several minutes there was only silence, punctuated by the crackle of radio communication. Then his voice came through, steady but subdued. "We have remains. 4 individuals, still secured in their positions." A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. Briggs closed his eyes briefly, then spoke into his own radio. "Proceed with documentation and recovery. Full honors protocol." Thomas watched as more team members entered the plane, carrying equipment and body bags. The process was slow and methodical, each movement photographed, each item catalogued. Through the opening, he could see glimpses of the interior, the skeletal framework of seats, the remnants of cargo netting, and shapes that had once been human beings, now reduced to bones and tattered uniforms. It was almost too much to bear, the stark reality of mortality preserved in metal and earth. After nearly 3 hours, the first remains were brought out, carried on a stretcher and draped with an American flag. The chaplain stepped forward and said a quiet prayer as the stretcher was placed into a waiting vehicle. One by one, the other crew members followed, each treated with the same dignity and reverence. Thomas removed his hat and held it against his chest, his throat tight with emotion. These men had been younger than his own son when they died, their lives cut short by a moment of catastrophe that had been forgotten by everyone except those who loved them. But even as the bodies were recovered, the team inside continued their work. Briggs received another radio transmission, and Thomas saw his expression change from somber to surprised. "What is it?" Thomas asked. Briggs looked at him, then back toward the plane. "There's cargo, a lot of it, and it's not what we expected." Within the hour, the first crates began emerging from the fuselage. They were military issue, stamped with faded markings and serial numbers, and surprisingly well preserved given the circumstances. The team set them down carefully on tarps spread across the ground, and specialists began prying them open under the watchful eyes of federal agents and military personnel. Thomas moved closer, his curiosity overcoming his hesitation. The first crate contained documents, thick bundles of papers sealed in waterproof pouches that had somehow survived the decades. An archivist carefully removed one of the pouches and opened it, revealing typewritten pages covered in official stamps and signatures. "These are classified flight manifests," she said, her voice hushed with awe, "and operational orders. This plane was carrying military intelligence documentation." The second crate held something entirely different. When the lid came off, several people gasped. Inside, packed in deteriorating cloth, were gold bars, each one stamped with the seal of the United States Treasury. There were at least 30 of them, their surfaces tarnished but unmistakable. Briggs immediately called for additional security, and armed guards took positions around the crates. Thomas stood frozen, staring at the gold. "What the hell was this plane carrying?" he muttered. One of the military historians, a colonel named Patterson who had arrived that morning, stepped forward to examine the contents. He picked up one of the documents from the first crate and read it carefully, his brow furrowing. "This flight was more than a routine supply run," he said finally. "According to these orders, they were transporting payment for a covert operation, likely related to intelligence gathering or resistance support in the Pacific Theater. The gold was probably meant for Allied operatives or to secure cooperation from local forces." He looked around at the assembled group. "This plane was on a secret mission. When it went down, the military must have assumed the cargo was lost or destroyed. They likely covered it up to avoid compromising ongoing operations." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally, but in the sense that everything he thought he understood had suddenly become more complex. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was a piece of hidden history, a mission so secret that its failure had been buried in official silence. The families of the crew had been told their loved ones died in a routine flight, never knowing they had been part of something far more significant. As the excavation continued, more items emerged. Radio equipment, encrypted codebooks, personal effects belonging to the crew, letters never sent, photographs of sweethearts and families, a harmonica, a pocket watch stopped at 3:17. Each item was a fragment of interrupted lives, dreams that ended in a Montana field on a cold March day in 1945. The team worked until sunset, carefully removing everything from the plane and cataloging it for transport to military archives and forensic facilities. By the time the floodlights came on again, the fuselage had been emptied, a hollow shell that seemed even more tragic now that its secrets had been exposed. That evening, Briggs pulled Thomas aside. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to understand something. What you found here, it's going to attract a lot of attention. The gold alone is worth several $1 million by today's standards, and the historical significance of the documents is immeasurable. There will be legal questions about ownership, federal claims, maybe even international interest, depending on what's in those papers." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I don't want the gold. I don't want any of it. Those men died carrying it. It belongs to their families, or to the government, or to whoever needs it more than I do." Briggs studied him for a moment, then nodded with something that looked like respect. "You're a rare man, Thomas Mitchell. Most people would be hiring lawyers by now." Thomas looked toward the plane, its broken form now fully visible in the harsh, artificial light. "I just want those families to know what happened. That's all. They deserve that much." Briggs extended his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. "We'll make sure they know," Briggs said. "Every one of them." As the night deepened and the team continued their work, Thomas walked back to his house, his boots heavy with mud, and his heart heavy with the weight of what had been unearthed. Inside, he poured himself a drink, something he rarely did, and sat by the window. Outside, the lights of the excavation site glowed like a small city that had sprung up overnight. He thought about the 4 men who had died in that plane, about the mission they never completed, about the families who had lived their entire lives with questions that were finally being answered. And he thought about his own father, who had bought this land despite the rumors, who had worked it and loved it and passed it down. Had he known? Had he suspected? Or had the secret been so well kept that even the whispers had faded to nothing? Thomas would never know. But he understood now that some stories take decades to tell, and some truths wait patiently beneath the surface until someone stumbles upon them by accident. Or maybe, he thought, it wasn't an accident at all. Maybe the land had been ready to give up its secret, and he had just happened to be the one there when it did. The days that followed brought a transformation that Thomas could never have anticipated. His farm, once a symbol of isolation and quiet routine, became the center of a story that rippled outward across the country. News crews arrived from Seattle, Denver, and even as far as New York, their satellite trucks lining the road like a caravan of modern pilgrims seeking truth. Reporters stood in his driveway, filming segments with the excavation site visible in the background, their voices urgent with the excitement of a story that touched something deep in the American consciousness. The discovery of the C-47 and its secret cargo became national news within 48 hours. Headlines screamed across newspapers and websites. Montana farmer uncovers lost Webby-Witu mission, secret gold shipment found after 80 years, 4 heroes finally coming home. Thomas watched it all, with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. He had never wanted fame, had never imagined his name would be spoken by strangers in cities he'd never visited, but there was no escaping it now. The military moved quickly to take control of the narrative and the artifacts. The gold was transported under armed guard to a secure facility, and the documents were classified once again pending review by military intelligence and the State Department. The remains of the 4 crew members were sent to a laboratory in Delaware where forensic experts would work to identify them definitively and notify their surviving relatives. Agent Briggs stayed on site for several more days, coordinating the effort and serving as liaison between the various agencies now involved. He and Thomas developed an unexpected rapport, 2 men from different worlds brought together by circumstance. On the 5th evening after the discovery, as the last of the equipment was being packed up, Briggs sat with Thomas on the porch, both men nursing beers and watching the sun set over the valley. "You did something important here," Briggs said quietly. "A lot of people go their whole lives without making this kind of difference." Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just found something. Didn't really do anything special." Briggs smiled. "You called it in. You could have kept quiet, tried to salvage the gold yourself, covered it back up to avoid the hassle. But you didn't. That says something about who you are." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the farm, the horses moving in their stalls, the distant call of an owl, the wind rustling through the tall grass. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Have they identified the crew yet?" Briggs nodded. "Preliminary identifications came through this afternoon. Captain James Holloway, 32 years old, from Portland, Oregon. Co-pilot Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 26, from Philadelphia. Radio operator Sergeant Daniel Costa, 24, from San Antonio. And Cargo Master Corporal Henry Sullivan, 22, from a small town in upstate New York." He paused, his voice softening. Sullivan was 2 weeks away from going home. His tour was almost over. Thomas felt the familiar tightness in his chest. "Do they have family?" "Sullivan's sister is still alive. She's 95 now, living in a nursing home in Albany. The others have children, grandchildren, nieces and nephews. We're reaching out to all of them. There's going to be a memorial service at Arlington in about 6 weeks. You're invited, of course. They want to thank you personally." The thought of standing before those families, of seeing their faces as they learned what had happened to their loved ones, filled Thomas with a complicated mix of emotions. He wanted to honor the dead, but he also felt like an intruder, someone who had stumbled into a private grief that wasn't his to witness. "I don't know if I should go," he said finally. "This is their moment, not mine." Briggs looked at him thoughtfully. "I think they'd want you there. You gave them answers. You gave them closure. That's a gift not many people get." Over the following weeks, as life slowly returned to something resembling normal, Thomas received letters. Dozens of them, then hundreds. They came from across the country, from veterans and their families, from historians and schoolchildren, from people who simply wanted to express their gratitude. One letter stood out from all the others. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope, addressed in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single page, written in the same uncertain script. "Dear Mr. Mitchell, my name is Dorothy Sullivan, and I am the sister of Corporal Henry Sullivan. For 80 years, I have wondered what happened to my little brother. He was supposed to come home in April of 1945. We had a party planned, a cake ordered, streamers hung in the living room, but he never arrived. For 8 decades I have lived with not knowing, with imagining him lost and alone somewhere, with the terrible weight of questions that had no answers. You have given me the greatest gift anyone could give. You have brought my brother home. I am 95 years old, and I do not have much time left on this earth. But I will die knowing that Henry did not disappear into nothing, that his story has been told, that he will be laid to rest with the honor he deserves. Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you from the bottom of my ancient, grateful heart, Dorothy Sullivan. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring with tears he didn't bother to wipe away. He folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of his desk, next to the deed to his land and the few photographs he had of his late wife. That night he dreamed of the 4 men in the plane, young and alive, laughing as they prepared for what they thought would be a routine flight. He saw them climbing aboard, securing the cargo, checking their instruments. He saw the moment everything went wrong, the plane shuddering, the ground rushing up, the final seconds of terror and impact. And then he saw something else, something he couldn't quite explain. He saw them standing in the field, looking at the excavation, at the flags and the honor guard, at the families who had come to remember them. And they were smiling. When he woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He got dressed and walked out to the site where the plane had been. The earth had been filled in and smoothed over, and new grass was already beginning to grow. In a few months, you wouldn't be able to tell anything had happened here at all. But Thomas would always know. He would carry this story with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that the past is never truly gone, that history lives in the soil beneath our feet, waiting patiently for the moment when it can speak again. He stood there for a long time, his hand resting on the fence post, feeling the connection between himself and something larger than his small life. He thought about the mission that had failed 80 years ago, about the gold that had been meant to buy freedom or information or cooperation in a war that had shaped the world. He thought about the 4 men who had given everything, who had died doing their duty, who had been forgotten until the land itself decided to remember them. And he thought about Dorothy Sullivan, 95 years old, and finally at peace, able to close a chapter that had remained painfully open for most of her life. As the sun climbed higher and the valley came alive with morning sounds, Thomas made a decision. He would go to Arlington. He would stand with those families. He would bear witness to the final homecoming of 4 men who had been lost too long. It was the least he could do. It was perhaps the most important thing he would ever do. 6 weeks later, Thomas Mitchell found himself standing in Arlington National Cemetery, wearing the only suit he owned, a black one he'd purchased for his wife's funeral years ago and hadn't worn since. The November air was crisp and cold, and the sky overhead was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Around him gathered more than 200 people, family members spanning 4 generations, military officials in dress uniforms, reporters kept at a respectful distance, and veterans who had come to honor their fallen brothers. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the solemnity of it all, by the weight of history made visible in rows of white headstones stretching endlessly in every direction. He stood near the back, trying to remain inconspicuous, but people kept approaching him, shaking his hand, thanking him with tears in their eyes. Each interaction left him feeling more humbled and more certain that he didn't deserve this attention. But Agent Briggs, standing nearby in his dress uniform, had told him firmly that morning, "You're part of this story now, Thomas. Accept it with grace." The ceremony began with the arrival of 4 flag-draped coffins, carried by honor guards, with movements so precise they seemed choreographed by time itself. A military band played hymns that drifted across the cemetery like prayers made audible. The chaplain spoke of duty and sacrifice, of men who had given their lives in service to something greater than themselves, of families who had waited generations for this moment. Thomas listened, his throat tight, his eyes fixed on the coffins. Inside those boxes were the remains of 4 men he had never met, but now felt connected to in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The families sat in the front rows, and Thomas could see Dorothy Sullivan in a wheelchair, a tiny woman wrapped in blankets despite the sun, her face lined with age, but somehow peaceful. Beside her sat a younger woman, perhaps 60, who kept one hand on Dorothy's shoulder as if anchoring her to this final moment. When the chaplain finished, a young Air Force captain stepped forward to read the names and service records of the fallen. Captain James Holloway Pilot, recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, survived by 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. A tall man in his 70s stood, his face a mask of controlled emotion, and saluted. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, co-pilot, survived by 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. A woman with silver hair stood clutching a folded flag to her chest. Sergeant Daniel Costa, radio operator, survived by 1 son, 3 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. An elderly man with a cane rose slowly, his lips moving in silent prayer. Corporal Henry Sullivan, cargo master, survived by his sister Dorothy Sullivan. The entire assembly turned to look at Dorothy, and slowly, painfully, she raised one trembling hand to her forehead in salute. The honor guard fired 3 volleys, the sound echoing across the cemetery like thunder. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes hanging in the air long after they faded. Then, one by one, the flags were folded with ceremonial precision and presented to the families. When the officer knelt before Dorothy and placed the flag in her lap, she clutched it to her chest and wept, her small body shaking with 80 years of grief finally released. Thomas felt his own tears falling freely now, and he didn't try to stop them. After the ceremony, as people gathered in small groups, talking quietly and sharing memories, Dorothy's niece approached Thomas. "Mr. Mitchell, my aunt would like to meet you." Thomas followed her to where Dorothy sat in her wheelchair, the flag still clutched in her arms. Up close he could see that her eyes, though dimmed by age, still held a sharp clarity. She reached out one hand, and Thomas took it gently, surprised by the strength of her grip. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with profound emotion. "Thank you for bringing Henry home." Thomas knelt beside her wheelchair so their eyes were level. "I'm honored to have found him, ma'am. I'm just sorry it took so long." Dorothy shook her head slowly. "No, it happened when it was supposed to happen. I believe that now. God kept Henry safe all these years until someone good would find him, and that someone was you." She released his hand and reached into a small bag on her lap, pulling out a photograph in a wooden frame. It showed a young man in uniform, barely more than a boy, grinning at the camera with the kind of confidence that comes from youth and hope. "This is Henry," she said. "This is my brother. I want you to have it." Thomas started to protest, but she held up her hand. "Please, take it. Put it somewhere safe. Remember him. That's all any of us can ask, to be remembered." Thomas accepted the photograph with both hands, looking down at the face of the young man he had helped bring home. "I promise," he said. "I'll remember." They sat together for several more minutes, Dorothy telling him stories about Henry as a child, how he loved to climb trees and catch frogs, how he'd enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor despite being too young, lying about his age until the recruiter finally gave up and let him sign. She spoke of the last letter she'd received from him, full of excitement about coming home and plans for the future he'd never have. When she finally grew tired, her niece thanked Thomas again and wheeled her away toward a waiting car. Thomas watched them go, the photograph still in his hands, feeling as if he'd been entrusted with something sacred. On the flight back to Montana the next day, Thomas sat by the window and watched the country pass beneath him, a patchwork of fields and mountains, cities and rivers. He thought about the gold, which the government had determined would be donated to a military museum after legal proceedings were completed. He thought about the documents, which historians were now analyzing to understand a mission that had remained secret for 8 decades. He thought about the plane itself, which would be partially restored and displayed at the Smithsonian. But most of all, he thought about the 4 men and the families who could finally grieve properly, who could visit graves and speak the names of their loved ones aloud without the hollow echo of uncertainty. When he arrived home, the farm looked exactly as he'd left it, but it felt different somehow. The land that had always been just property, just inheritance, now felt like hallowed ground. He had been chosen by chance or fate or providence to uncover a truth that needed telling, and in doing so, he had become part of a story much larger than himself. That evening, he placed Henry Sullivan's photograph on his mantel, next to the pictures of his own family. He stood back and looked at it for a long time, this young man frozen forever at 22, his whole life ahead of him, unaware that his final mission would take 80 years to complete. Thomas poured himself a drink and raised his glass toward the photograph. "Welcome home, Henry," he said quietly. "Rest well, you've earned it." Outside, the Montana wind whispered across the fields, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle called. The land stretched out in every direction, holding its secrets close, keeping watch over the stories it carried. And Thomas Mitchell, a farmer who had simply been doing his daily work, understood now that we are all temporary keepers of the places we inhabit, that the ground beneath our feet remembers everything, and that sometimes, when the time is right, it shares those memories with whoever is ready to listen. He had listened, he had acted, and 4 men who had been lost in silence had finally been found in honor. As darkness fell and the stars appeared one by one, Thomas sat on his porch and felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The discovery had changed his life, had brought chaos and attention and responsibility he'd never wanted. But it had also given him purpose, had connected him to something eternal, had reminded him that even the smallest actions can echo through time in ways we never imagine. The land had spoken, and the world had listened, and now, finally, everyone could rest. Thank you so much for watching this incredible true story with us. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. These tales of ordinary people encountering extraordinary moments remind us that history is alive all around us, waiting to be discovered. What have you learned from Thomas's story? What would you do if you found something like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. This is more than just a channel. It's a community of people who believe that every story matters, that every discovery has meaning, and that the past still has lessons to teach us. Share this video with someone who loves history, who appreciates sacrifice, or who simply needs to be reminded that sometimes the most important things we do are the ones we never planned. From all of us here, thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, keep looking, keep listening, and keep believing that the ground beneath your feet has stories to tell.